An elderly woman passed away and didn't leave a will. When her greedy daughter went to claim the inheritance, she was shocked to find out that Veronica Matthews sat in her corner office overlooking Manhattan, her manicured nails tapping impatiently on the polished mahogany desk. At 45, she was the youngest VP in her company's history, and today's meeting could cement her rise to the top. Her phone buzzed again, the 5th time in an hour. "Mom?" Again. With an irritated sigh, she silenced it. "Miss Matthews, the board is ready," her assistant announced. Veronica stood, smoothing her designer suit. "Let's do this." As she strode into the boardroom, her phone buzzed once more. She gritted her teeth and switched it off completely. 2 hours later, Veronica emerged victorious. The board had greenlit her proposal for a major acquisition. She allowed herself a small smile as she returned to her office. Success always tasted sweet. Her assistant intercepted her. "Miss Matthews, your mother's been calling non-stop. She says it's urgent." Veronica's smile faded. "Fine, I'll call her back." Closing her office door, she sank into her chair and stared at her phone. 5 missed calls and 3 voicemails. With a sense of dread, she pressed play on the first message. "Veronica, honey, it's Mom. Please call me back. It's important." Delete. Next message. "Veronica, I really need to talk to you. It's about, well, just call me, please." Delete. Final message. "Veronica." Her mother's voice sounded weaker now, almost desperate. "I know you're busy, but I need you to come home. Please, it's urgent. There was a pause, a shaky breath. "I don't have much time left." Veronica's blood ran cold. She quickly dialed her mother's number, her heart pounding. "Mom, what's going on?" "Veronica, thank God." Margaret's voice was thin, fragile. "I need you to come home, now." "Mom, I can't just leave. I have responsibilities here. Can't we talk over the phone?" "No, honey. This needs to be in person. Please, it's important." Veronica closed her eyes, memories flooding back. The last time she'd visited home, it had ended in a heated argument. She'd sworn she wouldn't go back. "Mom, is this about Dad again? I told you I don't want to discuss." "It's not about your father," Margaret interrupted. "It's about me, and you, and things you need to know." Something in her mother's tone made Veronica pause. "Are you sick?" There was a long silence. "Just come home, Veronica, please." The line went dead. Veronica stared at her phone, a knot forming in her stomach. She'd been avoiding home for years, building her career, leaving behind the small coastal town in Maine where she grew up. Now it seemed the past was calling her back. With a heavy sigh, she buzzed her assistant. "Cancel my meetings for the next few days. I need to book a flight to Maine." The trip to her hometown was a blur of anxiety and resentment. As her rental car wound through the familiar streets, Veronica felt like she was traveling back in time. Nothing had changed, yet everything felt different. She pulled up to her childhood home, a modest 2-story house overlooking the Atlantic. The paint was peeling, the garden overgrown. Had it always looked this old? Steeling herself, Veronica walked to the front door. Before she could knock, it swung open. There stood Margaret, a shadow of the strong woman Veronica remembered. She was thin, almost frail, her once vibrant red hair now streaked with gray. "Oh, Veronica," Margaret breathed, her eyes filling with tears. "You came." Veronica felt a lump in her throat. "Mom, what's going on? You look." "Come in, dear. We have a lot to talk about." As Veronica stepped inside, she noticed a small, ornate box clutched in her mother's hands. Something about it seemed vaguely familiar, stirring a distant memory. "What's that?" she asked. Margaret glanced down at the box, her grip tightening. "This? Oh, it's part of what we need to discuss. But first, let's sit down. I have something important to tell you, Veronica. Something that might change everything." Veronica followed her mother into the living room, her eyes darting around the familiar space. Everything looked smaller, older. Margaret settled into her favorite armchair, the mysterious box still in her lap. "Mom, what's this all about?" Veronica asked, perching on the edge of the sofa. Margaret took a deep breath. "I'm dying, Veronica, and I need to get my affairs in order." The words hung in the air. Veronica felt her world tilt. "What? How long have you known?" "A few months. It's my heart. The doctors say I don't have much time left." Veronica's mind raced. "Why didn't you tell me sooner? We could have gotten you better treatment, a specialist in New York, or—" "That's not what I want." Margaret interrupted. "I've made my peace with it, but there are things I need to do before I go, starting with my will." Veronica blinked. Your will? Margaret nodded. I need to finalize it, and I want you to help me. Okay, Veronica said slowly. What do you need me to do? I want to make some changes, significant ones. Veronica felt a flicker of unease. What kind of changes? Margaret's fingers tightened around the box. I want to leave a large portion of my estate to the community. What? Veronica stood up. Mom, that's ridiculous. You don't have that much to begin with. I have more than you think, Margaret said quietly. Veronica stared at her mother. What are you talking about? Before Margaret could answer, there was a knock at the door. A young man entered without waiting for a response. Margaret? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realize you had company. Veronica turned to face the intruder. He was in his mid-20s, with tousled hair and a friendly smile. Jake, Margaret said warmly. Come in. This is my daughter, Veronica. Jake's eyes widened. The famous Veronica. It's great to finally meet you. Veronica nodded curtly, annoyed by the interruption. What's wrong, Jake? Margaret asked. It's the community center. The roof is leaking again, and we're expecting a storm tonight. Margaret sighed. I'll call Bill in the morning. He'll fix it. Thanks, Margaret. You're a lifesaver, as always. Jake grinned and left as quickly as he'd come. Veronica turned back to her mother. Who was that? Jake? He helps out around town. Such a nice young man. Veronica felt a twinge of something. Jealousy? He seems very comfortable here. Margaret waved her hand dismissively. He's been a godsend since I got sick. Now, about the will. No, Mom. We're not talking about the will until you explain what you meant about having more than I think. And what's in that box? Margaret's face hardened. Veronica, there are things you don't understand. Things I've done. What things, Mom? You're not making any sense. I've been making donations, Veronica. Significant ones. To the town, to people who need help. Veronica felt her temper rising. Donations? With what money? Dad didn't leave us anything when he died. A shadow crossed Margaret's face. There's so much you don't know about your father, about our family. Then tell me, Veronica shouted. Margaret stood up, her face pale. I'm trying to, but you need to listen. There's a secret, Veronica, something that will change everything you think you know about us. Veronica felt her heart pounding. What secret? Mom, just tell me. Margaret opened her mouth to speak, but suddenly her face contorted in pain. The box slipped from her hands, clattering to the floor. Mom. Veronica rushed forward as Margaret clutched her chest, gasping for air. Call 911, Margaret wheezed before collapsing into Veronica's arms. Veronica fumbled for her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed. As she waited for the ambulance, holding her mother's limp form, her eyes fell on the fallen box. It had opened slightly, revealing a glimpse of old photographs and letters. What secrets was her mother keeping? And now, with Margaret unconscious, would Veronica ever find out the truth? The sound of sirens filled the air, and Veronica realized with a jolt that her entire world had just been turned upside down. Again. The ambulance wailed through the quiet streets of the coastal town. Veronica sat beside her mother, clutching her hand as the paramedics worked frantically. Margaret's eyes fluttered open briefly, focusing on Veronica. The box, she whispered. Don't forget. Before Veronica could ask what she meant, Margaret slipped back into unconsciousness. At the hospital, everything moved in a blur. Doctors and nurses rushed Margaret away, leaving Veronica alone in the sterile waiting room. She paced back and forth, her mind racing. What was the secret her mother wanted to tell her? What was in that box? Hours passed. Veronica called Jake, asking him to secure the house and the mysterious box. She couldn't shake the feeling that it was important. Finally, a doctor approached her. His face was grim. Miss Matthews, I'm sorry, but your mother's condition is critical. Her heart is failing. We're doing everything we can, but... Veronica felt the world closing in around her. Can I see her? The doctor nodded, leading her to the ICU. Margaret lay still, surrounded by beeping machines. Veronica barely recognized her mother in this frail form. Mom, she whispered, taking Margaret's hand. I'm here. I'm sorry for everything. Please, you have to pull through. You haven't told me the secret yet, remember? Margaret's eyes opened slightly. She tried to speak, but no words came out. Instead, she squeezed Veronica's hand weakly. Suddenly, the machine started blaring. Doctors rushed in, pushing Veronica aside. She watched in horror as they fought to save her mother's life. Clear, the doctor shouted, pressing the defibrillator to Margaret's chest. Once, Twice, 3 times. But it was too late. The steady tone of the flatline filled the room. Time of death, 2:17 a.m., the doctor said softly. Veronica stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Her mother was gone. The secret, whatever it was, had died with her. In a daze, Veronica collected her mother's personal effects. As she rifled through Margaret's clothes, her fingers brushed against something in the pocket of her sweater. She pulled out a small, ornate key. Veronica stared at it, her mind whirling. What did this key open? Was it connected to the box? To the secret her mother wanted to tell her? As dawn broke, Veronica left the hospital, the key clutched tightly in her hand. She felt numb, overwhelmed by grief and unanswered questions. Back at the house, she found Jake waiting on the porch. His face fell when he saw her expression. "Margaret?" he asked softly. Veronica shook her head, unable to speak. Jake stepped forward, wrapping her in a comforting hug. For a moment, Veronica allowed herself to be held, to feel the weight of her loss. Finally, she pulled away. "The box. Where is it?" Jake looked confused. "It's inside, where you left it." "Veronica, what's going on?" She brushed past him, heading straight for the living room. The box sat on the coffee table, closed and mysterious. Veronica approached it slowly, the key burning in her palm. Just as she was about to try the key in the lock, her phone rang. She didn't recognize the number. "Hello?" she answered cautiously. "Miss Matthews?" a man's voice said. "This is Howard Greenwood, your mother's attorney. I'm sorry for your loss. I know this is a difficult time, but there's an urgent matter we need to discuss regarding your mother's estate." Veronica's breath caught. Her estate? But she didn't finalize her will. "That's correct," Howard replied. "However, Margaret left a document with my office. She was very clear that it should be read immediately in the event of her death. Can you come to my office today?" Veronica looked at the box, then at the key in her hand. "Yes," she said finally, "I'll be there." As she hung up, Veronica felt a mix of emotions washing over her. Grief, guilt, and an overwhelming curiosity about what secrets her mother had been keeping. Whatever was in that document, whatever this key opened, Veronica knew her life was about to change forever. The question was she ready for the truth? Veronica spent the next few days in a haze, arranging her mother's funeral. She expected it to be a small, quiet affair. After all, Margaret had lived a modest life in this small town. But as Veronica made calls and visited the local funeral home, she was surprised by the response. "Your mother was a saint," Mrs. Johnson at the flower shop told her, eyes brimming with tears. "She helped my Tommy get into college. We could never have afforded it otherwise." At the grocery store, Mr. Patel insisted on donating food for the wake. "Margaret saved my business during the recession. I owe her everything." Everywhere Veronica went, she heard similar stories. Her mother, it seemed, had touched countless lives in ways Veronica never knew. As she walked down Main Street, lost in thought, she bumped into Jake. "Hey," he said softly. "How are you holding up?" Veronica shrugged. "I'm managing." "Jake, can I ask you something? Did you know about all the things my mother did for people here?" Jake nodded. Margaret was the heart of this community. She never wanted recognition, though, always insisted on keeping it quiet. "But how?" Veronica asked, frustrated. "We never had much money. At least, I didn't think we did." Jake looked uncomfortable. "I don't know the details. Margaret was pretty secretive about some things, but I do know she was working on a big project before she passed." "What project?" "A community center. She was planning to convert an old building into a place for after-school programs, job training, that sort of thing. But without her." Jake trailed off. Veronica felt a pang of guilt. Her mother had been planning all this, and she hadn't known a thing about it. As they talked, a memory surfaced. Veronica was 12, eavesdropping on an argument between her parents. "Margaret, you can't keep doing this," her father had said. "The money won't last forever." "I have to help them, John," Margaret had replied. "I can't just sit by when I have the means to make a difference." "And what about our daughter? What will be left for her?" The memory faded, leaving Veronica with more questions than answers. The day of the funeral arrived. The small church was packed, with people spilling out onto the street. Veronica sat in the front pew, feeling overwhelmed by the outpouring of love for her mother. As person after person stood to share stories about Margaret, Veronica felt a growing sense of disconnection. Who was this woman everyone was talking about? How could she have been so blind to this side of her mother? After the service, as people gathered for the wake, Veronica found herself cornered by Howard Greenwood, her mother's lawyer. "Miss Matthews, I know this isn't the best time, but there's something we need to discuss," he said quietly. "Your mother left a document with specific instructions. She wanted it read aloud after her funeral. Are you ready for that?" Veronica hesitated. Part of her wanted to run back to New York, to the life she understood, but a larger part needed answers. "Yes," she said finally. "I'm ready." Howard nodded. "I'll gather everyone then." As the lawyer moved away, Jake approached Veronica. "Everything okay?" "I don't know," Veronica admitted. "My mother left some kind of document. It's about to be read." Jake's eyes widened. "The project. It must be about the community center." "What do you mean?" Margaret was worried about what would happen to her plans if anything happened to her. She must have left instructions. Before Veronica could respond, Howard called for everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "Margaret Bennett left a document to be read upon her passing. With your permission, Miss Matthews, I'll proceed." Veronica nodded, her heart pounding. Whatever was in that document, she knew it would change everything. As Howard unfolded the papers, a hush fell over the room. Veronica held her breath, waiting to hear her mother's final words and the secrets they might reveal. Howard Greenwood cleared his throat and began reading Margaret's letter. "My dear friends and neighbors, if you're hearing this, it means I've left this world, but I hope my legacy will live on through you all." Veronica tensed, sensing that something significant was coming. "For years, I've been secretly donating to various causes in our community. This money came from an inheritance I received long ago, one that I've kept hidden for reasons that will soon become clear." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Veronica felt her heart racing. "I've decided to leave the majority of my estate to continue this work. The old Miller building will be converted into a community center, providing education and support for those in need." Jake's eyes widened in surprise and relief. "However," Howard continued, "there is a condition to this bequest. My daughter Veronica must oversee the project for 1 full year." Veronica stood up, shocked. "What?" Howard held up a hand and kept reading. "Veronica, I know this comes as a surprise. You've built a life far from here, but I'm asking you to reconnect with your roots. This year will be a challenge, but it's also an opportunity to understand the secrets of our family's past." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Veronica. "In my home, there's a box. The key to open it is with my personal effects. Inside, you'll find clues to a mystery that has shaped our family for generations. Solve it, Veronica, and you'll understand everything." Veronica's mind reeled. The key she'd found in her mother's pocket. This is what it was for. If Veronica completes this year and solves the mystery, she'll inherit her portion of the estate. If not, everything goes to the community fund. Howard lowered the letter. "That's all, Miss Matthews. Do you have any questions?" Veronica felt a surge of anger. "Questions? I have nothing but questions. How could she do this? I have a life, a career. I can't just drop everything for a year." Jake stepped forward. "Veronica, your mother wanted—" "I don't care what she wanted," Veronica snapped. "This is insane. She can't control my life from beyond the grave." The room erupted in whispers. Veronica stormed out, needing air. Outside, she paced back and forth, her mind in chaos. How could her mother have kept so many secrets? And now to spring this challenge on her? Jake followed her out. "Veronica, I know this is a shock, but what, Jake? You knew about this, didn't you? About the donations, the community center plans?" Jake nodded reluctantly. "I knew some of it. Your mother was trying to make a difference here." Veronica laughed bitterly. "By manipulating me? By keeping secrets her whole life?" "She had her reasons," Jake said softly. "Maybe this is her way of helping you understand them." Veronica shook her head. "I can't do this. I'm going back to New York. And leave all this unfinished? What about the community center, the people counting on it?" Veronica hesitated. Despite her anger, she couldn't ignore the impact her mother had on this town. "I need to think," she said finally. Back at her mother's house, Veronica found the box. With shaking hands, she inserted the key. It clicked open. Inside, she expected to find documents, maybe old photos. Instead, there was only a single piece of paper with a cryptic message. The truth lies where the land meets the sea, where promises were made and broken. Find the hidden door, and the past will reveal itself. Veronica stared at the note, frustration and curiosity warring inside her. What did it mean? And was she really willing to spend a year of her life chasing down her mother's riddles? As she pondered her next move, her phone rang. It was her boss in New York, wondering when she'd be back. Veronica looked at the note, then out the window at the town her mother had secretly supported for years. She had a decision to make, and the weight of it pressed down on her like a physical force. Whatever she chose, she knew her life would never be the same. Veronica stood outside the women's shelter, steeling herself for her first day of volunteering. She'd decided to stay, at least for now, driven by a mix of obligation and curiosity about her mother's secret. As she entered, a harried-looking woman approached her. "You must be Veronica. I'm Susan, the director. We're short-staffed today, so you'll be helping in the kitchen." Before Veronica could respond, she was whisked away to a cramped, bustling kitchen. "Just start chopping those vegetables," Susan instructed, hurrying off. Veronica stared at the pile of onions, completely out of her element. As she clumsily started chopping, a voice behind her scoffed. "So, you're Margaret's daughter? Doesn't look like you inherited her skills." Veronica turned to see an older woman eyeing her critically. "Excuse me? I'm Rita, known your mother for years. She could run this whole place single-handedly. You, on the other hand." Veronica felt her temper rising. "Look, I'm doing my best here." "Your best?" Rita laughed. "Honey, your best isn't going to cut it. These women need real help, not some city slicker playing charity." Before Veronica could retort, Susan rushed back in. "Veronica, we need you to look at some paperwork. It's about the new addition Margaret was planning." In the office, Susan showed her a stack of documents. "We're supposed to break ground next month, but there's a problem with the permits. Margaret was handling it, but now..." Veronica skimmed the papers, her mind racing. This was the project Jake had mentioned, and it was clearly in trouble. "I'll look into it," she said, surprising herself with her willingness to help. Later that afternoon, Veronica called her boss in New York. The conversation was tense. "Veronica, we need you back here. The Miller account is falling apart." "I know, Tom, but I can't leave yet. Family emergency." "How long is this going to take? We're not a charity, you know." Veronica winced at his choice of words. "I'm not sure. I'll keep you updated." As she hung up, Veronica felt the weight of her two worlds colliding. Her old life was slipping away, but this new one felt foreign and overwhelming. Back at her mother's house, Veronica was searching for more information about the shelter project when she stumbled upon an old diary hidden in Margaret's desk. She opened it, her heart racing. The first entry caught her eye. "Today I made a promise that will change everything. John doesn't understand, but I have to do this. For her. For us all." Veronica frowned. What promise? And who was her mother referring to? Before she could read more, her phone rang. It was Susan from the shelter. "Veronica, we have a situation. A pipe's burst, and the basement is flooding. We need to evacuate the women, but we don't have enough places to put them." Veronica's mind raced. This was a crisis, and she knew how to handle those. In New York, she'd have called in favors, thrown money at the problem. But here, she thought of her mother, of the stories she'd heard about Margaret's compassion and resourcefulness. "I'll be right there," Veronica said, grabbing her keys. At the shelter, chaos reigned. Women and children huddled in the lobby, while volunteers tried to salvage what they could from the flooded basement. Rita approached Veronica, her face grim. "Well, city girl, what's your plan? Going to call your rich friends to save us?" Veronica felt a flash of anger, then paused. What would her mother do? An idea struck her. "Susan, do we have a list of local churches and community centers?" Susan nodded, confused. "Call them. Ask if they can take in a few people each for the night. Rita, you know everyone in town. Start calling in favors. We're going to make this work." To Veronica's surprise, people jumped into action. As she coordinated the efforts, she felt a strange sense of satisfaction. This was different from closing a deal in New York, but somehow it felt more meaningful. By nightfall, every woman and child had a safe place to sleep. As Veronica locked up the shelter, exhausted but proud, she saw Rita watching her. "Not bad, city girl," Rita said grudgingly. "Your mother would be proud." Veronica felt a warmth in her chest at those words. As she walked home, her mother's diary heavy in her bag, she realized that for the first time since arriving, she felt like she might belong here after all. But as she thought about the mysterious entries she'd read, she knew her journey was far from over. What other secrets was her mother keeping? And was Veronica ready to uncover them? Weeks passed, and Veronica found herself falling into a routine at the women's shelter. One morning, a young woman named Sarah arrived, clutching a baby and looking lost. "I don't know what to do," Sarah confessed, tears in her eyes. "I lost my job, and now I can't afford rent." Veronica felt a sudden connection to Sarah. She remembered her own struggles as a young professional in New York, trying to prove herself. "Let's figure this out together," Veronica said, surprising herself with her gentleness. Over the next few days, Veronica helped Sarah create a resume and practice interview skills. When Sarah landed a job at the local diner, Veronica felt a sense of pride she'd never experienced in her corporate career. However, not everything was going smoothly. Veronica's attempts to manage the community center project led to a heated argument with Jake. "You can't just bulldoze through this, Veronica," Jake said, exasperated. "These things take time and community input." "Time we don't have," Veronica shot back. "If we don't move quickly, we'll lose the funding." "Your mother understood the importance of doing things the right way, not just the fast way," Jake retorted. Veronica felt a sting at the comparison. "Well, I'm not my mother." That night, unable to sleep, Veronica turned to Margaret's diary. She read an entry dated 20 years ago. "John's angry again. He doesn't understand why I can't let go of the past. But how can I, when it holds the key to everything? I have to protect Veronica, no matter the cost." Veronica frowned. Protect her from what? The mystery deepened. The next day, Veronica learned that a crucial grant for the shelter's education program was in jeopardy. Without it, many women would lose the chance to earn their GEDs. Instinctively, Veronica fell back on her corporate skills. She spent hours on the phone, negotiating with the grant committee, leveraging her New York contacts. By the end of the day, she'd not only secured the grant, but increased its value. When she shared the news, the shelter erupted in cheers. But Veronica noticed Jake's frown. "What?" she asked defensively. "It's great that you got the money," Jake said. "But throwing your weight around like that, it's not how things work here." Veronica felt a flash of anger, then uncertainty. Was she doing this all wrong? Later, sorting through old files, Veronica came across a photograph that made her heart stop. It showed her father, years younger, with his arm around a woman Veronica didn't recognize. They were smiling, looking at each other with unmistakable affection. Veronica turned the photo over. On the back was written, "John and Elena, 1985. Who was Elena? And why had Veronica never heard of her? Before she could ponder further, her phone rang. It was Howard Greenwood, her mother's lawyer. "Veronica, I've received an interesting offer," Howard said. "There's an investor who wants to buy your mother's property, all of it, including the land for the community center." Veronica's mind raced. "But the project?" "He's offering 3 times the market value," Howard interrupted. "It's an unprecedented amount." Veronica felt torn. The money could solve so many problems, but it would mean abandoning her mother's vision. "Who is this investor?" she asked. Howard paused. "That's the interesting part. He says he knew your father. His name is Robert Caldwell." Veronica's blood ran cold. She'd heard that name before in hushed arguments between her parents years ago. "He wants to meet with you," Howard continued, "to discuss the offer in person." Veronica's mind whirled. This mysterious investor connected to her father's past, wanting to buy the property her mother had worked so hard to protect. It couldn't be a coincidence. "Tell him I'll meet him," Veronica said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. As she hung up, Veronica looked at the photo of her father and the unknown woman, then at her mother's diary. She had a feeling that all the secrets, all the mysteries, were about to collide. Whatever Robert Caldwell wanted, Veronica knew this meeting could change everything. The question was she ready for the truth? Veronica sat across from Robert Caldwell in a local diner, her heart pounding. The man was in his 60s, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through her. "You look just like your father," Caldwell said, smiling. "How did you know my father?" Veronica asked, cutting to the chase. Caldwell's smile faded. "John and I were business partners a long time ago. Before he met your mother. Veronica felt a chill. And now you want to buy my mother's property? It's more complicated than that, Caldwell said. Your father and I had unfinished business. This property is part of that. As Caldwell explained his offer, Veronica's mind raced. The amount of money was staggering, enough to solve all the town's problems and set her up for life. I'll need time to think about it, Veronica said finally. Caldwell nodded. Of course, but don't take too long. This offer won't last forever. Back at the community center, Veronica found Jake reviewing construction plans. We need to talk, she said, explaining Caldwell's offer. Jake's face darkened. You can't be serious. This center was your mother's dream. It's not that simple, Veronica argued. With this money, we could do so much more for the town. By selling out everything your mother worked for? Jake shot back. Their argument escalated, drawing attention from volunteers. You don't understand what's at stake here, Veronica shouted. No, you don't understand, Jake yelled back. This isn't just about money, it's about community, about keeping promises. Veronica stormed out, her emotions in turmoil. She found herself walking to her childhood home, seeking something. Answers, maybe, or just a connection to her past. As she wandered through the rooms, memories flooded back. Playing in the backyard, her mother's laughter, her father's rare visits home. She paused in her parents' old room, running her hand along the faded wallpaper. Suddenly, a loose section caught her eye. Behind it, she found an old envelope. Inside was a letter, written in her mother's handwriting. John, I know you'll never forgive me for what I've done, but I had to protect our daughter. The truth would destroy her. I hope one day you'll understand, Margaret. Veronica stared at the letter, her mind whirling. What had her mother done? What truth was she hiding? Before she could ponder further, her phone rang. It was Susan from the shelter. Veronica, we need you. A storm is coming, and the roof is leaking badly. We might have to evacuate. Rushing to the shelter, Veronica found chaos. Rain poured through the ceiling, and frightened women and children huddled in the hallways. We need to get everyone out, Susan said, panic in her voice. Veronica looked around, her mind racing. Then she remembered the community center. It wasn't finished, but it had a solid roof. I have an idea, she said, already dialing Jake. Despite their argument, Jake answered on the first ring. What's wrong? Veronica explained the situation quickly. Can we use the center? There was a pause. It's not safe yet. The inspectors haven't. Jake, please. These people have nowhere else to go. Another pause. All right, I'll meet you there. As they rushed to move everyone to the center, the storm intensified. Wind howled and trees swayed dangerously. In the midst of the chaos, as Veronica helped a young mother carry her children to safety, something clicked. This, helping people, being part of a community, felt right in a way her life in New York never had. She thought of Caldwell's offer, of the letter she'd found, of all the secrets and lies that seemed to surround her family's past. As they finally got everyone settled in the community center, Veronica found herself standing next to Jake, both of them soaked to the bone. Thank you, she said softly. Jake nodded, his expression softening. You did good tonight, Veronica. In that moment, watching the relief on people's faces, feeling the sense of community that filled the room, Veronica had an epiphany. She understood, suddenly and completely, why her mother had fought so hard for this town. Why she'd kept secrets, made sacrifices, and she knew with a certainty that shook her to her core what she had to do next. Jake, she said, turning to him, we need to talk about the offer, about my mother, about everything. I think I finally understand what she was trying to do. Jake looked at her, surprise and curiosity in his eyes. Okay, let's talk. As the storm raged outside, Veronica prepared to reveal everything she'd learned, and to make a decision that would change not just her life, but the future of the entire town. The morning after the storm, Veronica called a town meeting. The community center was packed, buzzing with speculation about Caldwell's offer. Veronica stood at the front, her heart racing. I've made a decision, she announced. I'm not selling the property. A collective gasp filled the room. Jake's eyes widened in surprise. Instead, Veronica continued, I'm going to use my mother's inheritance to expand the community center project. We're not just going to build one center. We're going to create a network of support services throughout the town. The room erupted in a mix of cheers and confused murmurs. Veronica outlined her plan, drawing on her business experience to present a comprehensive strategy for growth and sustainability. As the meeting dispersed, Jake approached her. "I didn't think you had it in you," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. Veronica smiled. "Neither did I, but I think I finally understand what my mother was trying to do here." Their eyes met, and for a moment, the tension between them shifted into something else. Veronica felt her cheeks flush. "So," Jake said, breaking the moment with a grin, "ready to get your hands dirty with some real work?" The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Veronica threw herself into the project, working alongside volunteers to renovate her childhood home into a community space. One afternoon, as they were painting the living room, Jake accidentally splattered paint on Veronica's face. She retaliated, and soon they were both laughing, covered in colorful streaks. "You've got a little something," Jake said, reaching out to wipe a spot off her cheek. Their laughter faded as they realized how close they were standing. Veronica cleared her throat and stepped back. "We should, get back to work." Jake nodded, a slight blush on his cheeks. "Right. Work." As the project progressed, Veronica felt a growing sense of purpose. But her past wasn't done with her yet. Her phone rang one day. It was Tom, her boss from New York. "Veronica, this has gone on long enough. Either you come back now, or don't bother coming back at all." Veronica took a deep breath. "Then I guess I won't be coming back, Tom. I quit." The silence on the other end was deafening. Then Tom exploded, threatening lawsuits and ruined careers. Veronica listened calmly, then simply said, "Goodbye, Tom," and hung up. As she put down the phone, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Jake, who had overheard, gave her a questioning look. "I just quit my job," Veronica said, a mix of terror and exhilaration in her voice. Jake's face broke into a wide grin. "Welcome to the world of community service. The pay's terrible, but the benefits are pretty great." As they laughed together, Veronica realized how much she'd changed. The driven, career-focused woman she'd been in New York seemed like a stranger now. But even as Veronica settled into her new role, the mystery of her family's past still nagged at her. She spent her evenings poring over her mother's diaries and old documents, trying to piece together the truth. One night, as she was reviewing the project's finances, something caught her eye. There was a discrepancy in the numbers, a pattern of small but consistent irregularities. Digging deeper, Veronica's blood ran cold. Someone had been siphoning off funds from the project for years, and the trail led back to her mother. Shocked and confused, Veronica didn't know what to think. Had her mother been stealing from the very community she'd worked so hard to support? Before she could process this discovery, there was a knock at the door. It was Howard Greenwood, looking grim. "Veronica, we have a problem," he said. "Robert Caldwell is contesting your mother's will. He claims he has evidence that could invalidate everything, including your right to the property." Veronica felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Everything she'd built, everything she'd come to believe about her mother and herself, was suddenly in jeopardy. "What kind of evidence?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Howard hesitated. "He says he can prove that your mother was involved in some questionable activities, and that you're implicated too." Veronica's mind raced. The financial irregularities she'd just discovered. Was this connected? What had her mother done? And how was Veronica herself involved? As Howard continued explaining the legal challenge they faced, Veronica realized that the true test was just beginning. She would have to fight not just for the community center, but for her mother's legacy and her own future. The transformation she'd undergone was about to face its greatest challenge yet, and as she prepared to defend everything she'd come to care about, Veronica wondered if she was truly ready for the truth, whatever it might be. The local courthouse buzzed with tension as Veronica's legal battle against Robert Caldwell began. The entire town seemed to be packed into the small courtroom, their faces a mix of concern and support. Veronica sat beside her lawyer, Howard Greenwood, her heart pounding. Across the aisle, Caldwell smirked confidently. As the trial unfolded, Caldwell's lawyer presented evidence of financial irregularities in Margaret's accounts. Veronica's stomach churned as she recognized the discrepancies she'd discovered herself. "These records show years of misappropriated funds," Caldwell's lawyer declared. "Margaret Bennett was no saint. she was embezzling money from her own charities. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Veronica felt the weight of doubt settling over the crowd. But Howard was prepared. He called witnesses who testified to Margaret's generosity, her tireless work for the community. Slowly, the tide began to turn. Then came the bombshell. Caldwell took the stand, revealing his true connection to the family. "John Bennett wasn't just my business partner," he said. "He was my half-brother." The courtroom erupted in gasps. Veronica felt the world tilt beneath her. Caldwell continued, "John and I had a deal. Half of everything he owned was rightfully mine, including this property." As the trial wore on, Veronica found unexpected allies. Jake organized town meetings, rallying support. The women from the shelter shared stories of how Margaret and now Veronica had changed their lives. One evening, exhausted from another day in court, Veronica found the town gathered outside the community center. They'd brought food, supplies, and most importantly, their unwavering support. "We're with you, Veronica," Susan from the shelter said, squeezing her hand. "Whatever happens." Veronica felt tears prick her eyes. This was what her mother had built, what she was fighting for. The final day of the trial arrived. Caldwell's lawyer presented his closing arguments, painting Margaret as a fraud and Veronica as her unwitting accomplice. When it was Howard's turn, he surprised everyone by calling an unexpected witness. Rita, the gruff, older woman from the shelter. Rita took the stand, her face set in grim determination. "I've known Margaret Bennett for 40 years, she began, "and I know why she was moving money around." The courtroom fell silent as Rita revealed the truth. Margaret had been part of an underground network, helping women and children escape abusive situations. The financial irregularities were her way of covering her tracks, protecting those she helped. "She saved my life," Rita said, her voice cracking, "and the lives of countless others." As Rita spoke, Veronica felt pieces clicking into place. The secretive phone calls, the mysterious trips, the hidden documents. It all made sense now. Caldwell, sensing the shift in the room, made a desperate move. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change the fact that I have a legal claim to this property." Veronica stood up, unable to stay silent any longer. "No, you don't," she said firmly. "Because my father knew about your deal, and he protected us from it." She pulled out the letter she'd found hidden in the wall of her childhood home. "This proves that my father gave up his share of the business to keep this property safe. He knew what my mother was doing, and he supported her." The courtroom erupted in chaos. The judge called for order, then announced he'd review the new evidence before making his decision. As they waited for the verdict, Veronica felt a strange sense of peace. Whatever happened, she knew the truth now. She understood her parents, their sacrifices, their love. Jake found her outside the courthouse. "How are you holding up?" he asked softly. Veronica smiled. "You know, for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Their eyes met, and Jake leaned in slightly. But before anything could happen, the bailiff appeared. "The judge is ready." They rushed back into the courtroom, hearts pounding. The judge cleared his throat, preparing to deliver his verdict. Veronica held her breath. In this moment, everything hung in the balance. Her mother's legacy, the community's future, and her own place in the world she'd come to love. The judge began to speak, and Veronica felt the weight of her entire journey. From ambitious New York executive to small-town champion, resting on his words. Whatever the outcome, she knew she was no longer the woman who had reluctantly returned home months ago. She was someone new, someone her mother would be proud of. As the judge's decision hung in the air, Veronica prepared herself for whatever came next, ready to fight for her community no matter what. 1 year after Veronica's arrival in her hometown, the community gathered for the grand opening of the Margaret Wilson Community Center. The old Miller building, once abandoned, now stood proud and renovated, a testament to the town's resilience and unity. Veronica stood at the podium, facing the crowd that had become her extended family. "A year ago, I didn't understand what my mother was trying to build here. Today, I'm honored to continue her work." She cut the ribbon, and cheers erupted. People flooded into the center, marveling at the classrooms, counseling offices, and daycare facilities. Veronica watched as children excitedly explored the new playground, while adults peeked into the computer lab and job training rooms. Susan, now the center's director, approached Veronica with tears in her eyes. "Margaret would be so proud," she said, squeezing Veronica's hand. "You've turned her dream into something even more beautiful than she imagined." As Veronica walked through the bustling hallways, she overheard snippets of conversation that made her heart swell with pride. A group of women discussing their new small business venture, launched with help from the center's entrepreneurship program. A teenager excitedly telling his friend about the coding class he'd just signed up for. An elderly man volunteering to teach a local history course. Later that afternoon, Veronica attended the first graduation ceremony for the center's GED program. The small auditorium was packed with family and friends of the graduates. As each name was called, Veronica felt a surge of emotion, remembering the individual struggles and triumphs of each student. Sarah, the young mother she'd helped months ago, was among the graduates. As she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, her young son cheered from the audience. After the ceremony, Sarah found Veronica, hugging her tightly. "I never thought I'd make it," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing in me." Veronica felt a lump in her throat. "You did all the hard work. I'm just glad I could help." Sarah shook her head. "It was more than that. You showed me that I could have a different life, that I could be more than my circumstances. My son has a future now, because of what you've built here." As the sun began to set, Veronica found herself drawn to the beach. The sound of the waves had always calmed her, even as a child. She walked along the shoreline, reflecting on the whirlwind of the past year. Jake joined her, their hands brushing as they walked. The tension between them had been building for months, a slow burn that neither had been ready to acknowledge until now. "Quite a day," Jake said softly, his voice barely audible over the crashing waves. Veronica nodded. "I can hardly believe how much has changed." They stopped, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Jake turned to her, his expression serious. "Veronica, She met his gaze, her heart racing. "Yes? I'm really glad you stayed," he said, leaning in closer. "When you first came back, I thought you were just another city slicker who'd run back to New York at the first opportunity. But you proved me wrong. You've become the heart of this community, just like your mother was." Veronica felt tears prick her eyes. "I never thought I'd find a home here, but now, I can't imagine being anywhere else." Their lips met in a gentle kiss, years of tension and growing affection finally finding release. When they parted, Veronica smiled. "So am I, Jake, so am I." As they walked back towards town, hand in hand, Veronica felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was where she belonged. Back at home, Veronica opened her mother's diary, reading the final entry she'd been saving for this moment. Her hands trembled slightly as she turned to the last page. "My dearest Veronica, if you're reading this, it means you've chosen to stay, to understand. I'm so proud of you, my brave girl. There's one last thing you need to know. The money that funded all of this, it came from your grandfather, Robert Caldwell's father. He left it to me in secret, wanting to make amends for the pain he caused our family. I used it to help others, to break the cycle of pain, and now it's yours to continue that work. I love you, sweetheart. Never forget how strong you are. Mom." Veronica sat back, tears streaming down her face. Finally, all the pieces fit together. The secret her mother had kept for so long, the true source of the legacy she'd built. It was all rooted in a desire to heal old wounds and create something positive from a painful past. She spent the night reading through old letters and documents, piecing together the full story of her family's history. The feuds, the misunderstandings, the ultimate reconciliation. It was all there, a tapestry of human struggle and redemption. As dawn broke, Veronica felt a sense of peace settle over her. She understood now, in a way she never had before, the weight her mother had carried and the vision that had driven her. The next morning, Veronica met Jake at the center. The building was already buzzing with activity. Children played in the new playground while adults attended classes inside. Rita, now a volunteer literacy tutor, waved as they passed. "Never thought I'd see the day when this old place was full of life again," she said gruffly, but her eyes were warm. "What's next?" Jake asked, slipping his hand into hers. Veronica smiled. "We keep building. There's still so much to do." They walked through the center, discussing plans for new programs, a mentorship initiative for at-risk youth, a partnership with local businesses to provide job training and placement, expansion of the women's shelter to include transitional housing. As they talked, Veronica felt a surge of excitement. This was just the beginning. With the resources her mother had left her and the support of the community, there was no limit to what they could accomplish. That evening, Veronica sat on the porch of her childhood home, now her home again. She held her mother's memory box, filled with photos, letters, and mementos. As she sifted through the contents, each item brought back a flood of memories. A photo of her parents on their wedding day, both looking young and hopeful. A pressed flower from the garden her mother had tended so lovingly. The small stuffed bear Veronica had clung to as a child, now worn and faded. Looking out at the town she'd grown to love, Veronica reflected on her journey. From a driven executive focused only on success, she'd become part of a community, making a real difference in people's lives. The transformation still amazed her. She thought of her mother's secret work, her father's sacrifice, and the truth about her family's past. It wasn't the legacy she'd expected, but it was one she was proud to continue. Jake joined her on the porch, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Penny for your thoughts?" Veronica leaned into him. "Just thinking about how life can surprise you. A year ago, I never would have imagined this." "Do you ever miss your old life?" Jake asked, a hint of insecurity in his voice. Veronica shook her head emphatically. "Not for a second. This is where I belong." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the town. Veronica felt grateful for the twists and turns that had brought her here. She had found her purpose, her home, and a love she never expected. As the stars began to appear, Veronica thought about the future. There would be challenges, she knew. Running the center, expanding their programs, continuing to heal the wounds of the past. None of it would be easy. But for the first time in her life, she felt truly equipped to face whatever came her way. She had her mother's strength, her father's determination, and the support of a community that had become her family. More than that, she had a clear sense of who she was and what she wanted to accomplish. The next chapter of her life was just beginning, and for the first time, Veronica was excited about the unknown. She would face whatever came next with the strength her mother had seen in her all along. In that moment, looking out at the community she now called home, Veronica knew that her mother's legacy and her own would continue to grow and thrive. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had led her exactly where she needed to be. As night fell, Veronica and Jake went inside, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring. Together, Veronica paused at the doorway, taking one last look at the town bathed in moonlight. She whispered a quiet thank you to her mother, wherever she was, for setting her on this path. Then, with a smile on her face and hope in her heart, Veronica stepped into her home, ready to write the next chapter of her story. A story of love, community, and the enduring power of legacy. If you enjoyed Veronica's journey of self-discovery and community transformation, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more heartwarming stories. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Veronica's shoes? Remember, sometimes the greatest adventures begin when we least expect them, and the most precious treasures are often found right where we started.